There's a specific kind of moment most people have had at least once. You say something to a partner, a colleague, a friend, and the words come out sharper than you intended, more cutting, and you feel it immediately. That wasn't quite you, or it was you, but a version of you that you don't recognize and don't like, or the inverse. Someone else does something that bothers you in a way that feels disproportionate. The irritation is too large for the situation, and if you're honest, there's something familiar about what you're reacting to, something you can't quite name. Carl Jung had a name for it. He called it the shadow, and what he described in the early 20th century, working from clinical observation, from dream analysis, from decades of watching how people behave versus how they explain themselves, maps onto what modern neuroscience has since found by entirely different means. Jung's basic observation was this: the conscious self, what he called the ego, is a selection, not the whole person. A curated portion of the person, the parts that got approved, that fit the self-image, that were acceptable to family, culture, circumstance. Everything else gets pushed out, not destroyed, not gone, pushed into what Jung called the unconscious, and the accumulated mass of rejected material he called the shadow. The shadow isn't evil. That's the most common misunderstanding. It's not the dark side in any moral sense. It's simply everything the ego decided not to be. Yes, that includes genuinely destructive impulses, but it also includes creativity that was told it was showing off, ambition that was told it was selfish, anger that was told it was dangerous, sexuality that was told it was shameful, grief that was told it was weakness. Whatever didn't fit, whatever got the message early enough and firmly enough that it wasn't welcome, went into the shadow. And it didn't stop existing there. It went underground and started operating from underground. The way the shadow operates is through what Jung called projection. Because the ego can't acknowledge the rejected material as its own, it sees it in other people. The person who was trained to believe that anger is unacceptable doesn't experience their own anger directly. They experience other people as aggressive, as threatening, as constantly on the edge of violence. The anger exists. It just gets attributed outward. The person who buried their ambition doesn't experience themselves as competitive. They experience other people as status-obsessed, as shallow, as always trying to get ahead. The content varies, the mechanism doesn't. What you can't see in yourself, you see everywhere else. This is why Jung's diagnostic question was almost the reverse of what you'd expect. Instead of asking what's wrong with the person in front of you, he was interested in what infuriated them, what disgusted them, what they found intolerable in others. Not because the other person was innocent, but because the intensity of the reaction was data about the reactor. Strong reactions to things that have nothing to do with you are frequently not about the other person at all. They're the shadow, pointing at itself from the outside. There's a specific pattern Jung documented in clinical work that makes this concrete. He noticed that the qualities people find most intolerable in others tend to cluster. It's not random. Someone who was raised to value humility above almost everything else tends to find arrogance uniquely unbearable. More unbearable than someone who wasn't raised that way. Someone trained from early on that neediness is weakness tends to react to vulnerability in others with contempt that goes beyond what the situation calls for. The excess is the tell. Ordinary dislike is calibrated. You encounter something you don't prefer, you note it, you move on. Resentment, which Nietzsche described, is one version of excess, but projection is another. When the reaction has a life of its own, when it follows you from situation to situation, when it attaches to people who barely know you're in the room, that's not perception. That's your own material, externalized. Jung documented a specific clinical phenomenon he called enantiodromia, the tendency for extreme one-sidedness to eventually flip into its opposite. The person who suppresses anger so thoroughly that they have no access to it doesn't stay calm indefinitely. The anger accumulates in the shadow and eventually erupts in a form that seems to come from nowhere, that the person often can't fully account for, that contradicts everything they believe about themselves. The suppression didn't eliminate the material, it pressurized it. This is not metaphor. Affect regulation research in contemporary psychology has documented precisely this dynamic. Emotional suppression increases physiological arousal, doesn't decrease it. The effort required to not feel something consumes resources and increases the intensity of the suppressed state. James Gross at Stanford has spent decades documenting this with controlled studies. Suppress enough, long enough, and the shadow gets loud. Now here's where it gets interesting. Jung was working in the early 1900s. He had no brain imaging equipment, no access to the cognitive neuroscience that would emerge decades later. His tools were observation, clinical inference, and an unusual tolerance for sitting with what he couldn't yet explain. What he was describing, a vast system of mental activity operating outside conscious awareness, shaping behavior, driving reactions, influencing perception, was speculative by the standards of his time. It's not speculative anymore. Modern neuroscience has documented with increasing precision what happens in the brain below the threshold of conscious awareness. The work starts with a basic finding. Most of what the brain does, it does without telling you. Neuroscientist Joseph LeDoux spent years mapping what he called the low road of emotional processing. When you encounter a threat, real or perceived, your amygdala processes it and triggers a response faster than the information can reach your cortex for conscious evaluation. The fear response, the startle, the defensive posture, these happen before you know why. You experience the result. You don't experience the processing. This is not a malfunction, it's by design. The brain's fastest systems are unconscious because consciousness is slow. Survival historically required responses that preceded deliberation, but those same fast, unconscious systems don't distinguish cleanly between real physical threats and social threats, or between current situations and past ones that merely resemble them. They pattern match, and they act before you can override them. Beyond threat response, there's the broader category of what psychologists call implicit cognition. Mental processes that operate automatically, without conscious intention or awareness, and that shape behavior in measurable ways. The most studied example is implicit bias. Researchers using the implicit association test, developed by Anthony Greenwald and colleagues in the late 1990s, found that people hold strong automatic associations between social categories and attributes, associations that frequently contradict their stated beliefs and values. People who explicitly believe in equal treatment show measurable automatic preferences. The preferences aren't conscious. They don't feel like preferences. They feel like neutral perception. But they influence judgment, behavior, and decision-making in ways that show up consistently in controlled conditions. This is not identical to what Jung called the shadow, but the structural parallel is precise. Material operating outside conscious awareness, shaping behavior, invisible to the person it belongs to, and frequently the opposite of the identity they consciously endorse. There's also the research on what psychologists call the introspection illusion. A series of studies by Timothy Wilson, documented in his book Strangers to Ourselves, established something genuinely uncomfortable. People are not reliable reporters of their own mental states. When asked why they made a decision, why they felt a certain way, why they reacted as they did, they produce explanations that feel accurate and coherent, and are, in many cases, demonstrably wrong. The explanations aren't lies, they're confabulations. The conscious mind, which didn't actually drive the behavior, constructs a narrative afterward that makes the behavior make sense. The narrative feels like the cause. It arrived after the fact. Wilson's phrase for the adaptive unconscious, the vast system of mental processing that actually drives much of behavior, was a stranger to ourselves. The title is the finding: you are, in significant ways, unknown to yourself. Jung would have found this unsurprising. He spent his career watching people explain themselves in ways that clearly didn't account for what they were actually doing. There is one more dimension worth naming. Jung believed the shadow wasn't only personal. He thought there was a collective layer, patterns of rejected material shared by cultures, by groups, by historical periods. Things a society decides it doesn't want to be, that get suppressed at scale, and that eventually return in distorted forms. He wrote about this in the context of World War I and World War II, about what happens when an entire civilization disowns its capacity for violence and projects it entirely onto external enemies. About the particular danger of collective moral certainty, which often signals collective shadow in operation rather than collective wisdom. Contemporary social psychology has its own version of this in research on moral licensing. The documented tendency for people and groups who have established their moral credentials in one domain to feel implicitly permitted to behave worse in another. The suppressed impulse doesn't disappear. It finds a door. Jung's framework and the experimental data don't use the same language, but they keep arriving at the same place. The material you don't acknowledge doesn't stop influencing you. It influences you more because it operates in the dark. What both frameworks, Jung's and the neuroscientific one, converge on is a specific practical problem. The behavior that most needs to be examined is the behavior that feels most automatic, most justified, most obviously a response to something external. The reaction that seems like clear perception is often the one most shaped by unconscious processing. The person you find intolerable is often holding material you haven't claimed as yours. The situation that triggers a response wildly out of proportion to its actual stakes is often activating something old, something that got filed away before you had the language or the safety to deal with it directly. Jung's term for this, when an unconscious complex gets activated and temporarily takes over conscious behavior, was being seized. The ego steps aside without knowing it stepped aside. Something else runs the response. And afterward, the person often doesn't fully recognize themselves in what they did. The neuroscience equivalent is implicit processing, overriding deliberate cognition under conditions of stress, time pressure, or strong emotional activation. Same phenomenon, different vocabulary. The question this raises isn't comfortable. If significant portions of behavior are driven by material the conscious self doesn't have access to, if projection is structurally built into perception, if the adaptive unconscious is operating constantly beneath the narrative you tell yourself about why you do what you do, then how much of what you think of as your character is actually yours? Jung's answer was, more than you think once you do the work to see it, less than you think if you don't. The work he described was confrontation with the shadow, not in any mystical sense, but in the practical sense of learning to recognize projection, learning to ask what your strongest reactions say about you rather than the person you're reacting to, learning to notice the gap between the self you present and the self you suppress. This is genuinely difficult because it requires a specific kind of honesty that runs against a very deep grain. The ego's primary function is to maintain a coherent, stable self-image. Confronting the shadow threatens that image. It asks you to accept that the things you find most repellent in others may be things you carry yourself. That the person you've been most certain about, yourself, is in meaningful ways a stranger. Most people don't do this work because the discomfort is real and the payoff is slow and invisible. What Jung argued, and what the clinical evidence supports, is that the cost of not doing it is higher. The shadow doesn't wait. It operates continuously, and the less you know about it, the more freely it operates. Every major relationship you damage with a reaction you can't explain, every opportunity you sabotage because something triggered something old, every pattern that repeats itself across different contexts with different people, those are the shadow working. Not dramatically, not obviously, just steadily, underneath everything, doing what unconscious systems do when they're left unexamined, not to eliminate the shadow. Jung was clear on this. The goal isn't to become someone without darkness, without contradiction, without the rejected material. That's not integration. That's a different kind of suppression. The goal is to know what's in there, because the alternative isn't that the shadow disappears. It's that it operates without your knowledge, in your name, and you spend your life explaining away the results. Neuroscience doesn't offer exactly the same prescription. Its framework isn't therapeutic in the Jungian sense. But what it does offer is the same underlying finding. Awareness changes the system. Studies on implicit bias show that people who understand the mechanisms of automatic processing show measurably different patterns than those who don't. Not because understanding eliminates the processing, but because it interrupts the gap between impulse and action. The reaction still arrives. The automatic association still fires, but it gets flagged before it becomes behavior. That gap between the unconscious process and the conscious response is where something different becomes possible. Jung called that gap consciousness. Neuroscience calls it executive function. The name matters less than the function. The function is, you are not required to be entirely run by what you haven't examined. What's remarkable across all of this is not that Jung anticipated neuroscience. He didn't predict the amygdala. He didn't anticipate the implicit association test. He wasn't making neurological claims. What he did was look carefully at behavior, at the gap between what people said and what they did, between the self they presented and the self that showed up under pressure. And he constructed a model that was accurate enough to survive contact with a completely different body of evidence a century later. A clinical observer in the early 1900s and a cognitive neuroscientist in 2024 are looking at the same thing from different angles and drawing diagrams that, when overlaid, are closer than either tradition typically acknowledges. The unconscious is not a metaphor. It's not a philosophical convenience. It's a name for a real system that operates in every person, constantly, and that shapes far more of daily life than the conscious self is usually willing to admit. Jung named it. Neuroscience is measuring it. The gap between those two things is smaller than it looks. Thank you so much for getting this far. It's a great pleasure to have you following our content, and if made sense to you, or if it helped you see things from a different perspective, please consider subscribing to the channel. It means a lot to us. I will see you in the next video.